The rain hadn't stopped for 3 hours when the knock came at my door at 11 at night, sharp and desperate, like someone pounding not just with their fist but with everything they had left inside them. I opened it to find Mira standing there, soaked to the bone, mascara running down her cheeks in dark rivers, her hands trembling as she clutched a small bag to her chest. My neighbor's wife. The woman I had exchanged nothing more than polite nods and borrowed cups of sugar with for the past 2 years. And in that moment, with thunder cracking somewhere behind her and her voice barely holding together, she asked me the one question I never expected to hear: can I stay here tonight? If this story moves something in you already, I want you to like this video, drop a comment below, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe to this channel, because what happened over the next few days changed the way I understood kindness, boundaries, and what it truly means to be a good neighbor in a world that often forgets how. My name is Arjun, and at the time, I was 34 years old, living alone in a modest 2-bedroom house at the end of a quiet street, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone but nobody really knew anyone. I had moved in after my divorce 2 years prior, carrying with me a heaviness I hadn't fully unpacked, choosing solitude over the noise of trying to explain myself to people. Mira and her husband Rohan lived 3 houses down, a couple who, from the outside, seemed to have it all figured out. They hosted barbecues. They walked their dog together every evening. They waved at everyone with the kind of practiced warmth that made you believe their life was as smooth as it looked. I had always envied that, quietly, the way you envy something you've convinced yourself you'll never have again. Standing in my doorway that night, Mira looked nothing like the composed, graceful woman I had seen laughing on her porch just days before. She looked shattered. I remember the way she kept glancing over her shoulder toward the street, as if she expected someone to come chasing after her, and the way her voice cracked when she repeated her question, softer this time, almost ashamed of having to ask it all. I didn't hesitate long. Whatever awkwardness existed between 2 near strangers evaporated in the face of a person who was clearly in pain. I stepped aside and let her in, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and made her a cup of tea she barely touched. She didn't explain right away, and I didn't ask. We sat in my living room in a silence that felt strangely comfortable, the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled because both people understand that words will come when they're ready. It was nearly midnight when she finally spoke, her voice hollow, telling me that she and Rohan had been fighting for weeks, that something had shifted between them so gradually she almost hadn't noticed until it became a canyon too wide to cross with conversation alone. Tonight, she said, the fight had turned into something uglier, something that involved raised voices and a slammed door and words neither of them could take back. She hadn't planned on ending up at my house. She said she had just started walking in the rain and somehow, without meaning to, found herself standing on my porch because it was the only door on the street she felt she could knock on without judgment. I told her she could stay in the guest room, no explanation needed, no conditions attached. I want to be honest with you here, because this story only works if I am honest. There was a strange, complicated moment where I felt something stir in me, an awareness of her vulnerability, of the fact that she was a beautiful woman sitting in my home in the middle of the night. But I pushed that feeling down hard and buried it somewhere I didn't examine too closely, because I understood, even in that moment, that what she needed from me wasn't attention or comfort of that kind. She needed safety. She needed someone who would ask nothing of her in return. And I decided right then that I would be that person, no matter what it cost me internally to hold that line. The next morning, she was quiet over breakfast, embarrassed in the daylight for what had felt so necessary in the dark. She thanked me repeatedly, apologized for imposing, and mentioned that she would go back home once Rohan had cooled off, once she figured out what to say to him. But days passed, and she didn't go back. Rohan, it turned out, hadn't called or texted or come looking for her, and that silence from him seemed to wound her more than the fight itself had. I watched her scroll through her phone at my kitchen table, hoping for a message that never arrived, and I saw something in her eyes that I recognized because I had lived it myself, the particular loneliness of being invisible to the one person who was supposed to see you most. Over that week, Mira told me more about her marriage, not all at once, but in fragments, the way people reveal painful things when they trust that you won't use it against them. She told me that Rohan had once been attentive, funny, present, but that somewhere along the last 3 years he had become distant, consumed by his work, dismissive of her feelings, quick to anger over things that didn't matter and silent about things that did. She told me she had tried therapy suggestions, date nights, honest conversations, and each attempt had been met with promises that dissolved within days. She wasn't looking for someone to fix her marriage or tell her what to do. She just needed a witness, someone to confirm that what she was feeling was real and not, as Rohan often implied during their arguments, an overreaction. I listened. That was really all I did, but I've come to understand that listening, without an agenda, is one of the rarest gifts one person can give another. I made sure she ate proper meals. I gave her space when she needed it and company when the silence became too loud. I never once brought up anything that could be mistaken for romantic interest, because I understood, with a clarity that surprised even me, that doing so would have been a betrayal not just of Rohan, a man I barely knew, but of Mira's trust in me, and of my own sense of who I wanted to be. There is a kind of integrity that only reveals itself in private moments, when no one is watching and doing the right thing costs you something. This was one of those moments, stretched across many days, and I held onto it even when it was hard. The neighborhood, of course, began to talk. I noticed the way Mrs. Fernandez 2 doors down started watching my house a little too closely, the way conversations at the corner store seemed to pause when I walked in. Someone must have seen Mira's car in my driveway, or noticed she hadn't been home in days, and the story that formed in people's imaginations was far more scandalous than the truth. I heard whispers, second-hand, about an affair, about home wrecking, about the quiet divorced man down the street who had swooped in the moment a marriage showed cracks. It stung more than I expected it to. I had spent 2 years rebuilding a version of myself I could respect after my own divorce had left me feeling like a failure, and now that same reputation was being quietly dismantled by people who had never bothered to ask me a single question. I remember one afternoon, standing at my mailbox, when Mr. Patel from across the street approached me with a look that was somewhere between concern and accusation. He asked me directly if it was true, if I was the reason Mira and Rohan's marriage was falling apart. I felt anger rise in my throat, sharp and defensive, but I took a breath and told him the truth as plainly as I could, that a woman had come to me in distress, that I had given her shelter because that is what decent people do for one another, and that nothing had happened between us beyond conversation and kindness. He didn't look entirely convinced, and I realized then that some people will believe the story that excites them more than the story that is simply true. That realization hurt, but it also clarified something for me. I hadn't done this to be believed or praised. I had done it because it was right, and that had to be enough, even when it felt like it wasn't. Meanwhile, Rohan finally reached out, not to Mira, but to me. He showed up at my door on the 8th day, unshaven, eyes red-rimmed from what looked like sleepless nights, and he asked, in a voice stripped of all the confidence I'd seen him carry on his porch, whether his wife was okay. I told him she was safe, that she was healing, and that if he wanted to see her, the choice had to come from a place of genuine change, not desperation born out of embarrassment or fear of what the neighborhood was saying. He broke down a little on my doorstep, admitting things I don't think he had admitted to himself before that moment, that he had let his career eclipse his marriage, that he had taken Mira's steadiness for granted, assuming she would always be there no matter how he treated her, and that her absence over the past week had forced him to confront a version of his life he didn't recognize and didn't like. I told him I couldn't fix what was broken between them, that it wasn't my place to, but I offered to let him talk to her in my living room, on neutral ground, if she was willing. When I relayed this to Mira, she sat with it for a long time before agreeing, her hands twisting in her lap, fear and hope warring visibly on her face. That evening, I made myself scarce, walking to the small park at the end of the street and sitting on a bench as the sun went down, giving them the privacy they needed to say whatever needed to be said. I don't know exactly what was spoken in my living room that night, but when I returned, I found them sitting together, not touching, but closer than distance alone, the air between them softer than it had been in days. What followed wasn't an instant fairy tale reconciliation, because real healing rarely works that way. Mira didn't move back home that night. She told me she needed to see consistent change before she trusted words again, and I respected that, continuing to let her stay in my guest room for another week while Rohan began the slow work of proving himself, showing up for a counseling session he had previously refused, cutting back his hours at work, sending small, sincere messages that weren't demands for her to come home but simple acknowledgments of what he had done wrong. I watched Mira read those messages with a cautious kind of hope, the kind that has been burned before and is afraid to trust its own warmth again. During that time, something shifted in me too. Having her presence in my home, even platonically, even briefly, reminded me of what it felt like to have someone to talk to at the end of the day, to share a meal with, to exist alongside without the crushing weight of loneliness I had grown so used to that I'd stopped noticing it. I didn't fall in love with Mira, and I want to be clear about that, because that isn't what this story is about. But I fell back in love, in a way, with the idea that I was capable of showing up for someone else fully, without needing anything in return, and that capacity had felt dormant in me since my own marriage had ended. 3 weeks after that first desperate knock on my door, Mira moved back home. She stood on my porch the morning she left, her bag packed, and thanked me in a way that felt different from her earlier apologies, steadier, more grounded. She told me that what I had given her wasn't just a place to sleep, but a reminder that she deserved to be treated with care, and that the way I had treated her, with respect and without expectation, had shown her what a baseline of decency actually looked like, a baseline she intended to hold Rohan to going forward. I told her I was proud of her for choosing herself first, even if the path led her back to the same house she'd left in the rain. The neighborhood gossip didn't disappear overnight, but it faded the way most gossip does, starved of the drama it had hoped to feed on. Mrs. Fernandez eventually brought me a plate of homemade cookies as an unspoken apology for her earlier suspicion. Mr. Patel nodded at me with something like respect the next time we crossed paths. And Rohan, in the months that followed, became someone who waved at me not out of politeness but out of genuine gratitude, occasionally stopping to tell me how things were improving, how he and Mira had started taking walks together again, real ones, filled with conversation instead of silence. I think about that night often, the sound of rain against my window and a stranger's wife standing on my porch asking for shelter. It would have been easy to make that story into something else, something the neighborhood wanted to believe, something that satisfied a hunger for scandal rather than substance. But I've come to believe that the quiet, unglamorous choice to simply do the right thing, especially when no one is watching and everyone is assuming the worst, is one of the most powerful things a person can offer another human being. Kindness without agenda. Shelter without conditions. Trust rebuilt not through grand gestures but through small, consistent acts of integrity. Before I close this story, I want to ask you for something small but meaningful. If this story touched you, if it made you believe a little more in kindness, in second chances, in the quiet strength it takes to do right by someone even when it's hard, please take a moment to comment below and tell me which part moved you the most. I read every single one, and your words remind me why I keep telling these stories. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Stories like this only reach the people who need them. When you like the video, share it with someone who might need a reminder that goodness still exists, and subscribe for more stories that remind us of the quiet, powerful ways we can show up for one another. Mira and Rohan are still together today, stronger for having nearly lost each other, and I still live at the end of that quiet street, grateful for a rainy night that taught me more about compassion than I ever expected to learn from a knock on my door.